The sound of paper slamming echoed across the glass table. Thomas Grayson, our celebrated CEO, shoved quarterly filings toward me as if they were evidence in a trial. "Sign it, Paula, or you're finished." My throat tightened. Heat rushed to my face. 16 years of compliance expertise reduced to a public ultimatum. Laughter from one corner, silence from another. No defense, no dignity, just dismissal. What Thomas never realized was that beneath his flashy numbers lay a web of clauses, silent tripwires built to guard the company. One small trigger, and his empire could crack open overnight. Before I continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city below and hit subscribe. You won't believe how fast this turned against him. The slap of the report against the boardroom table was louder than it should have been. Thomas Grayson, our CEO, leaned across the polished surface and shoved the stack of papers toward me as if he were throwing down a gauntlet. "Sign it, Paula," he barked, his voice echoing off glass walls, "or you're done here." My chest tightened, and for a split second the room blurred. 16 years of protecting this company's compliance record, and he reduced it to a single ultimatum in front of half the executive floor. My pen was still in my hand, but my fingers refused to move. He wanted me to rubber stamp hidden debts, to certify lies he had tucked into the quarterly filings. I glanced around the table. Some eyes avoided mine, others looked at me like I was already gone. No one spoke. Eric, the CFO's lapdog, smirked faintly, enjoying the spectacle. Thomas pressed harder. "You either play along or you pack your desk. I won't let some compliance clerk sink my numbers." My throat burned, but I kept my voice level. "I won't sign what isn't true." A ripple of silence followed. He laughed, sharp and cruel. "Then you've signed your own termination." Just like that. My title, my authority, my dignity, stripped with a sentence. Humiliation settled on my shoulders as I slid the pen onto the table and pushed the filings back. Thomas thought it ended there. What he didn't realize was that beneath his numbers lived a network of safeguards, and one overlooked clause could split his empire wide open. When I walked out of that boardroom with my badge still clipped to my jacket but my authority gutted, I didn't need to argue or plead. My silence was louder than their applause for Thomas's so-called brilliance. What none of them knew, not even the CFO's shadow Eric, was that I had spent years weaving compliance safeguards into every major vendor agreement, each clause written in precise legal language, each trigger tied to actions exactly like the one Thomas had just forced onto paper. They thought compliance was ornamental, something you dusted off for regulators and audits, a box to check. For me, it was the foundation. I had buried in those contracts auto-escalation clauses. If financial statements deviated from declared liabilities, vendors were permitted, no, required, to freeze payments and alert oversight bodies. It wasn't sabotage, it was protection, and every signature Thomas had chased with his silver tongue was now bound to it. He saw a report. I saw a living system, each page wired to trip if dishonesty walked across it. The irony was bitter. I had once explained these clauses in a meeting years ago, using plain words. If truth breaks, the contract reacts. They dismissed it as legal paranoia, but I never dismantled the framework. It stood behind every glossy press release, every shareholder call, humming quietly like a lock nobody cared to notice. Thomas thought his humiliation ended me. What he actually did was press his hand against a tripwire hidden in the corporate walls. And now that I had refused to insulate him, those walls would stop listening to his voice. I didn't need revenge. I needed only patience, because once the first trigger fired, the entire structure of his empire would begin to shift under its own weight. The first crack didn't roar. It whispered. By Monday morning, I was back at my desk, technically still employed but stripped of sign-off power, my name absent from the circulation list. Thomas strutted through the hallways, still basking in the glow of his staged victory, unaware he had lit a fuse. He ordered Eric, the CFO's obedient shadow, to finalize the filings without me. Eric moved quickly, feeding the altered numbers into the system, confident the board would applaud Thomas for shaving millions off liabilities. What he didn't realize was that those filings weren't just numbers on a page. They were connected to the web of clauses I had written years earlier, clauses designed to sense dishonesty like a smoke detector senses heat. The moment Eric pushed submit, the first vendor flagged an inconsistency. Their system compared declared liabilities with contractual payment terms and found a gap. Automatically, a compliance freeze activated, halting their next scheduled transfer. No alarms blared in the office, no sirens sounded, but the effect was immediate. Funds that should have flowed on Monday morning were quietly locked in place. I noticed it first because I still had read-only access to the vendor portal. A small red marker blinked where the payment confirmation should have been. I leaned back in my chair, heart steady, knowing the system was breathing on its own. Across the building, though, Thomas didn't notice. He was too busy rehearsing sound bites for a shareholder call, promising strong fundamentals and seamless operations. Eric brushed off minor vendor complaints as technical delays, telling his team to reboot servers, but the safeguards didn't respond to IT patches. They were written into contracts, activated by truth, enforced by law. By noon, a second vendor froze a payout, then a third. Each one triggered by the same hidden debt Thomas thought he buried with my signature. What he never understood was that compliance isn't paper, it's steel. And once steel locks, it doesn't care about charm or ego. Still, the office hummed as if nothing was wrong. Phones rang, assistants typed, executives prepped their PowerPoints. Only I knew that beneath the calm surface, the machinery was shifting. A slow tightening of gears that would soon be impossible to unwind. I sat quietly, not gloating, not even smiling, simply watching the red markers multiply. Every one of them meant that another piece of Thomas's empire had slipped out of his control. He had turned my refusal into a personal humiliation, but what he actually did was press a sequence of switches I had placed years ago. Now the system was following its own logic, not his. And though the building looked intact, though his voice still carried across the marble lobby, the foundation was already loosening, and it would take only one more step for the entire weight to come crashing down. By Tuesday morning, the silence in the building had changed. It wasn't the normal hum of keyboards and muted phone calls. It was the uneasy quiet that follows when people sense something off, but can't name it. Vendors began emailing the finance team, polite at first, then firmer. Scheduled payments hadn't cleared. Eric muttered excuses about bank delays, but the tone of the responses sharpened with each hour. I watched from my limited portal access as red flags multiplied, a growing constellation of frozen transactions that no one else seemed to connect. The real shift came when Rachel Kim, the external auditor, arrived earlier than expected. She was supposed to begin her quarterly review the following week, but she walked into the building with a folder already thick with questions. "Why are liabilities reported differently here than in your vendor logs?" she asked Eric in front of 3 managers. He stammered about data syncs and temporary variances. Thomas brushed past them, booming about innovation and resilience, waving away Rachel's concerns as if she were a nuisance. But Rachel wasn't a nuisance. She was the match. She pressed further, requesting full access to payment trails, and I knew then that the clauses were working as designed. Every inconsistency was automatically escalating to her office, each freeze a legal signal she couldn't ignore. Around me, staff whispered, confused why simple invoices were bouncing back, why vendors who had never raised their voices were now threatening legal notices. I didn't say a word. Thomas still thought he had won by humiliating me, but he hadn't noticed that the scaffolding of his empire was beginning to sway. The cracks were no longer invisible, they were spreading across the walls for anyone willing to look. And soon, even his voice would not be enough to drown out the sound of the structure groaning under its own weight. By Wednesday morning, the chain reaction was impossible to ignore. What had begun as a few scattered freezes now spread like cracks through a windshield, each new fracture making the whole pane weaker. Vendors across 3 states were demanding explanations for halted payments, legal departments firing off notices with words like breach and non-performance. The compliance clauses I had buried years ago were now alive, reacting not to my hand, but to the lies Thomas had forced into the filings. The brilliance of it, if I could call it that, was how quiet the escalation was. No alarms blaring, no servers crashing, just contracts silently enforcing themselves, one after another, until half the company's financial arteries were clotted. The first real jolt came when a priority supplier, one whose name appeared in every quarterly investor call, announced it was suspending shipments until outstanding invoices cleared. Suddenly, the warehouse floor, which had looked stable the day before, was stacked with unsent orders. Logistics managers called finance called Eric, and Eric marched into Thomas's office white-knuckled. I saw them pass by my desk, voices raised, though the glass walls muffled the details. 10 minutes later, Thomas emerged, face flushed, tie loose, declaring to anyone who could hear that it's a temporary glitch. But the numbers disagreed. By noon, the estimated frozen amount reached $22 million. The stock, already volatile, slipped nearly 6% in a single trading window. Traders might not have known the details, but they could smell instability, and the market never forgives the scent of rot. Inside the building, the facade of calm cracked wider. Assistants were pulling double shifts answering vendor calls. Middle managers drafted canned responses about delays under review, but the more they spoke, the less convincing it sounded. Rachel, the auditor, now had a stack of discrepancy reports taller than her desk, and she wasn't letting go. She requested a closed-door meeting with the board's audit committee, bypassing Thomas entirely. That alone was enough to set off whispers in every corridor. I sat at my desk, watching red markers flood the portal, each one proof that the system was working exactly as I designed it. There was no glee, no vindication, only the steady confirmation that truth does not stay buried. Thomas stormed through the floor at 3 p.m., barking orders to override vendor systems manually. The IT team looked bewildered. Contracts don't bend to code. By the end of the day, 3 lawsuits had landed in legal's inbox, 2 regulators had requested urgent clarification, and the stock had bled another 12%. The empire was unraveling in real time, but Thomas still carried himself like the room belonged to him. He told the communications team to draft a press release about temporary reconciliation delays. Even as he spoke, a message pinged across the internal portal. Another vendor freezing all activity pending investigation. The ripple was becoming a wave, and Thomas's voice, once so commanding, was drowned out by the sound of the company's own contracts tightening around him. He believed he had broken me. What he never understood was that he had only broken himself, and the safeguards I built were now accelerating his fall with a precision no one could stop. Thursday morning began with a sound I had never heard in our building before. Silence in the executive wing. No laughter, no casual chatter, just the heavy stillness of people waiting for something irreversible. The board had convened an emergency session, and Rachel Kim, the auditor, was already inside, laptop open, evidence scrolling across her screen. I wasn't invited, of course, but word travels fast when panic settles in. The numbers told a story Thomas could not drown out with charm. 22 million frozen, lawsuits filed, regulators circling, stock sliding toward catastrophe. Thomas tried to preempt the disaster with bravado. He strode into the boardroom like a man about to close another deal, chin high, voice loud. He began with a speech about innovation bottlenecks and temporary vendor misalignments. But Rachel cut him off before he could spin the first sentence. "This isn't a bottleneck," she said firmly, her voice carrying beyond the glass walls. "This is contractual enforcement. Your own filings triggered it." She turned the screen toward the board. Rows of clauses highlighted in red, each tied to false declarations Thomas had ordered Eric to submit. Each one a self-executing trap. Linda Morales, the board chair, sat forward, hands clasped. "Are you telling us these freezes are automatic?" Rachel nodded. "They were designed years ago. They activate when liabilities are hidden. You don't have a compliance problem. You have a Thomas problem." The room fell into a silence so sharp it made my skin prickle even from outside. Thomas's jaw twitched, but he tried to laugh. "These clauses are technicalities," he scoffed. "Paula was always over-engineering the paperwork." He gestured toward me through the glass, as if dragging me back into the fight he thought he had won. But Rachel shook her head. No, this is not over-engineering. This is foresight. And it's airtight. She tapped a key, and the screen refreshed with the latest data. Another 6 vendors frozen, total exposure approaching 40 million. Gasps rippled through the room. Thomas slammed a hand on the table, accusing me of sabotage, but the consultant dialed in from New York cut him short. Mr. Grayson, the man said coolly, what I see here is not sabotage. It's a system built to protect the company from exactly this behavior. You ignored it. Now it's protecting everyone else from you. The board members exchanged glances, the kind that end careers. Linda's voice was quiet, measured, final. Thomas, step outside. He tried to argue, but his words came out strangled, the bravado leaking out of him with every syllable. He looked smaller as security guided him from the room, his tie crooked, his shoulders sagging. For the first time, he resembled what he truly was, a man who thought charisma could outvote truth. Inside the boardroom, the conversation shifted. The panic gave way to resolution. Rachel outlined steps to stabilize operations, and every path circled back to the same name, mine. I had become the architect they needed, the only one who could untangle the mess. When Linda finally emerged, she paused by my desk. You'll hear from us shortly, she said simply, and walked on. Around me, colleagues who had avoided eye contact for days now stared openly, their silence laced with something new, recognition. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I sat still, letting the weight of the moment settle. The collapse wasn't loud or cinematic. It was precise, surgical, like a structure folding in on itself exactly where the flaws had been ignored. Thomas thought humiliation was an ending. He never realized it was a trigger. And now, with the empire buckling under its own dishonesty, the truth was no longer mine to defend. It was alive in every contract, every frozen account, every lawsuit piling at the company's door. The collapse had a voice of its own, and it spoke louder than he ever did. By Friday morning, the company was unrecognizable. The glossy confidence that once clung to every hallway had drained out, replaced with hushed conversations and darting eyes. Thomas's office stood empty, the blinds drawn as if the walls themselves were ashamed. Word spread quickly. He had been stripped of authority and reassigned to a meaningless, special projects role, the corporate exile reserved for leaders too dangerous to fire outright, but too toxic to keep in power. Eric, who had followed him so loyally, tried to defend his actions, but the evidence spoke louder than his excuses. The regulators had already opened inquiries, subpoenas were on their way, and the vendors that once feared losing contracts now held the upper hand. The board moved swiftly, more out of survival than morality. Linda Morales addressed the executive floor in a short, clipped announcement. She admitted to significant compliance failures and promised a new era of accountability. Not once did she say my name, but everyone in that room knew where the phrase came from. My inbox overflowed with cautious thank yous, half apologies, and veiled attempts at flattery from colleagues who had once looked away when I was humiliated. I didn't answer any of them. The building itself seemed quieter without Thomas's voice bouncing off the glass, yet the silence wasn't peace. It was aftermath. The fragile stillness after a storm when people measure the damage and wonder what pieces can be salvaged. Vendors were renegotiating, regulators circling, lawsuits multiplying. The company would survive, but scarred. And I walked through the corridors with a different weight in my step. Not pride, not triumph, but certainty. The empire had collapsed exactly as the safeguards predicted, and now the ruins belonged to those who had mocked their necessity. I didn't need to celebrate. The consequences spoke for themselves. The following week, the board extended an offer I never expected. They wanted me to step into the role Thomas had disgraced, handing me the title of Chief Financial Officer, along with the authority to rebuild what he had broken. It was flattering, even tempting, but as I sat across from Linda Morales and listened to her practiced pitch about restoring confidence, I realized the answer had already settled in me. I had no desire to inherit the wreckage Thomas left behind. I had spent 16 years protecting truth in a place that treated truth as disposable. My loyalty wasn't to titles or offices, it was to integrity itself. So I declined, politely but firmly. Instead, I accepted an offer that had been waiting quietly in my inbox. A partnership at a Wall Street compliance firm that valued independence, equity, and the voice I had been denied for so long. The choice wasn't about escape, it was about freedom. Freedom from being the silent guardian no one thanked. Freedom from boardrooms where arrogance masqueraded as leadership. As I packed my office for the last time, I left no trace of regret. The safeguards I had built would remain, humming in the background, protecting the company even without me. That was my legacy, silent, but undeniable. Walking out of the building, the Chicago air felt sharper, cleaner. I didn't look back at the tower of glass and steel where my name had been erased and then resurrected. I didn't need to. The empire had already learned what it cost to ignore compliance, and I had learned what it meant to choose myself. The collapse was theirs. The freedom was mine. I learned something the hard way. Arrogance isn't just a personality flaw, it's a structural weakness. Thomas believed his charisma could bend numbers, that compliance was a nuisance, that if he shouted loud enough, the truth would bow. But the truth doesn't bend. It waits. And when it's ignored, it grows heavy, until the system itself cracks. I didn't have to sabotage anything. The safeguards I wrote years earlier, dismissed as over-engineering, did exactly what they were meant to do. They protected the company from dishonesty. His downfall wasn't triggered by me. It was triggered by his refusal to respect the fragility of the very system he was trusted to lead. In today's American corporate culture, shortcuts are everywhere. Leaders push for speed, optics, and quarterly wins, while employees who warn about risks get sidelined. But ignoring those safeguards doesn't erase them. It only ensures they'll explode later. You should feel validated if you've ever been called too cautious or paranoid. The very details others mock may be the ones that keep a company standing. Practical systems aren't invincible. One clause, one safeguard, one overlooked inconsistency can topple an empire built on ego. Respect those small cracks before they spread. How to get started today. Document every irregularity, no matter how small. Build processes that enforce integrity automatically, not manually. Keep evidence outside the reach of those who might pressure you. Never let arrogance silence a warning. Restate it, escalate it, preserve it. Revenge isn't about striking back, it's about letting fragility reveal itself. I stood still, and the empire collapsed under its own weight. What about you? Have you ever seen arrogance expose a crack no one wanted to face? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe so more people can see how fragile power really is.